Hey y'all, my name is Manny Pelaez. It is 5:30 p.m. Welcome to our town hall zoning no, it's not zoning the honing, it's honing the zoning. It's more exciting because it rhymes. And so I'm so happy you guys showed up. And what we're gonna be doing today is having a really in-depth conversation with Michael Shannon, the Director of Development Services, and Francine Romero, PhD. She is our zoning commissioner for District 8 at the San Antonio Zoning Commission. I'm your city councilman for District 8. So with that said, let me tell you about my friend, Michael Shannon. You know, he was appointed to the Development Services Department in 2017 after serving nearly 5 years as the Assistant Director of the Field Services Division and the Deputy Building Official for the city. And as the city's building official, he oversaw more than 450 employees with a budget of more than $37 million for the Development Services Enterprise Fund and another $15 million from the general fund in fiscal year 2020. Michael is a registered professional engineer with his specialty in fire protection engineering, and he holds multiple International Code Council national certifications, including a certified building official, and he's also a Texas state licensed code enforcement officer. So Mike is the #1 guy out at Development Services. And Mike knows absolutely everything there is to know about zoning and code enforcement. Welcome, Mike. I'm glad you're here. And then we've also got Dr. Francine Romero from our Zoning Commission, and I'm going to share your bio with her a little later. But right now, Mike, I think it's best if you kind of give us a Zoning 101 crash course so that everybody can, we can all be on the same page and sort of set the tempo for the rest of our conversation. Take it away, Mike.
All right, thank you, Councilman. I really feel like we could have sent you a bunch of additional information and you would have read that out for me. So thank you. Good evening, everyone. It's great to be here with Councilman Pelaez and his staff, Dr. Romero, but really all of you. So I'm kind of excited to talk a little bit about zoning. And you know, zoning is an important part of what we do here in San Antonio. And what zoning is really help ensure that our city is built out or developed in a way that you know, promotes the health, safety, and welfare for really everyone. So what is zoning? So that's a question we get a lot. And you know, Development Services is essentially your zoning department for the city. We're the zoning department, building department, code enforcement department, but you know, a lot of what we do is getting a piece of land ready to get built or to get used a certain way. So zoning really is, it's just the legal use of the land or the property, and it tells you what you can do or what you can develop on that property. And there's some basic zoning concepts. Zoning is given to us, the allowance to zone property was given to us by state law. So Texas allows us to have zoning regulations as a city. We put those in our Unified Development Code. Our Unified Development Code, or UDC, is a chapter of our city code that really regulates all of our zoning, tells people how they can build out new subdivisions or redevelop existing subdivisions, commercial and residential. But when we talk about zoning, zoning really talks about 3 different aspects. You have residential zoning, you have commercial zoning, and you have industrial zoning. So whenever you're talking about zoning, it really boils down to those 3 things. However, it's really not that simple, because residential, which is generally where someone lives or sleeps, that could be a house, a duplex, it could be a hotel, it could be an apartment complex. So we have a lot of different residential categories. We have a lot of different commercial categories, some small neighborhood commercial type things, a small store right outside of the neighborhood, or you have a large commercial development, something like the RIM development or La Cantera over there on IH-10 and 1604 and a lot around our city. And then we have industrial categories, you know, the Toyota manufacturing plant, smaller factories and warehouses. So all in all, those three main categories, we have about 35 individual subcategories that we use in our code to let people know what they can use their property for. So that's a big, broad overview of zoning. And even after those 35 categories, we have overlay districts. Sometimes you have historic districts or overlay corridors that have some additional regulations as to what a property can look like and be developed as. So we have a lot of information in our code. So we have a lot of team members. If you do have questions about what you can do with your property or your neighbor can do with their property, we answer those phone calls, pretty much all day. So every single piece of property in San Antonio is zoned. So we have almost 500,000 parcels or pieces of property in San Antonio. We're 500 square miles. So every piece of property has zoning. You have zoning on your property where you live, where you work. But many times you all get engaged, and the councilman and his colleagues get engaged when someone wants to change their zoning. And so if you want to change the zoning, who can do that? So the next slide talks about who can apply for a zoning change. Well, state law says really only two people. I've listed three because I'm going to explain it, but you have to be the property owner of the property. You can be a developer who's going to buy that property if you have permission from the property owner. Maybe a condition upon sale said, hey, if we can rezone your property, I'll buy your property. So you have to be the property owner or have the property owner's permission. Or the city of San Antonio, they can, through council action, request a rezoning. Now, that's not too common. It doesn't happen too often, but it does. On occasion where the need is, or where there's a historic overlay property or they want to deem historic, so that happens. But again, if I wanted to change my neighbor's property without their permission, I can't do that. I can't change them from residential to commercial or vice versa, and that's based on state law, okay? So that's really where these zoning applications come. Most of them, again, come from property owners that want to do something different with their property. And let's talk a little bit quickly. I'll just kind of give you the overview of how the process works. So the owner is very involved with a zoning change application. However, the neighbors immediately around the property also get some input. Okay, so what happens here is a little flow chart we put together. And I know it's kind of wordy, but we'll just, someone applies and says, I'm a residential property or I'm a commercial property and I want to do something a little bit different because I want to redevelop it into, a commercial strip center to build stores, or I want to build some single family homes or apartments. So I'm going to apply. They come down to my office, they fill out an application or do it online. I have team members that are trained in planning and land development. That's where, they get trained in our codes. So they review all that and do a technical staff review. And then what we do is we set a hearing in front of the zoning commission. Dr. Romero will talk about that a little bit, but those are open public meetings, and therefore we have to notify not only the people around that property, but we put a sign in the ground. Some of you have seen those yellow signs that says rezoning. If you have any questions, call down to our office and talk to the case manager. We put it in the newspaper, and then we mail out to properties within 200 feet. So if you are within 200 feet of the boundary of that property that wants rezoning, you will get a mail out that just says something to the effect of, heads up, this is a notification that the property owner has requested the rezoning of this property from whatever they have to whatever they want. And we invite you to weigh in as a neighbor that's relatively close to this property. And you can mail in, you can call in, you can, right now we're not actually doing in person, but we're doing virtual meetings, somewhat like this. So you can be part of that live. And you can tell the zoning commission members what you think, whether you like or don't like that proposal to rezone. So what that'll do is my staff will make a recommendation to the zoning commission. Sometimes we have to go to planning commission because the city has some plans, neighborhood plans that also have to be looked at. But most zoning cases don't require that. Some do. but we'll have those open hearings, and those are open public hearings. And the zoning commission and the planning commission, if applicable, they will make a recommendation. What they cannot do is they cannot rezone someone's property, but their job is to make a recommendation to city council and the mayor. So once that hearing happens and there's a notification, there's a recommendation from the commission, we then take that case and we schedule it for city council consideration. Usually it's about a month after the zoning commission hearing. And we go through the same step. We notify everybody within 200 feet that there's a hearing in front of city council. If you'd like to weigh in, provide input, you love this idea, you hate this idea, city council wants to hear it, and the mayor, so that when they vote on it, they'll have the input and how it affects the neighborhood and the surrounding neighborhood. So that's this process. But the most important takeaway there is we want your input. If you are around there, if you live within 200 feet or in a registered neighborhood or homeowners association, we want to hear, I know the council does, but city staff, we want to hear and get your information to the zoning commission and city council. So after we get through that, or actually as we're getting through all that, I think I talked about it already, but I think I have a slide here that talks about neighbors being notified. But on the next slide, you'll see that the 200 feet of the affected property receive a letter. And again, it may sound like snail mail in today's electronic age, but we're required to do that. It's a very effective way for us to notify people. And it's also required by state law. So we like to be in compliance with state law when we do this process. That's really important. Thank you. So registered neighborhood associations are also notified by mail. So we have most of our neighborhood associations or homeowners associations in San Antonio, they are registered with us. It's one of the benefits of actually registering with the city, just giving us your name, your officers, and current contact information. We want you to get this notification early. And then, of course, I mentioned the big yellow sign. So the next slide is really just, I know the councilman and his staff will put some questions together, and I'm sure you have a lot. Whenever I talk zoning, there's usually a bunch of questions. But I think the key is that it's really an important process, and we really need and want everybody's input on these. And again, a lot of the rezonings, there's a lot of good comments that people like the rezoning, and there are some that people don't like the rezoning request. But again, that's the process we go through, and I'm excited to be here to answer any of your questions.
Mike,
so with that, I'll hand it back to the councilman.
Thank you so much, Mike. I really appreciate it. So just a reminder for those of you that joined us while Mike was talking, welcome to our town hall on all things zoning. I'm glad to see a lot of you guys signed in. If you ever want to see this presentation again, we're recording it and it'll be made available for you on Facebook and other social media channels. We also require, just to make sure that everybody is able to hear, please turn off your microphones. Some of you joined us, but I'm seeing all microphones off except for one or two. And so if you can, hit the mute button. I appreciate that. Mike, so you gave us the 101, the rundown, and pretty simple to understand, right? There's a process. There's a team that works for you out there waiting to receive applications from property owners and who say, I want to change my zoning designation. And then once you receive it, it makes its way through your staff, then it's presented to the zoning commission. And then if it's presented to the zoning commission at some point, it may get sent up to city council. But correct me if I'm wrong, at any moment during this process with all the multiple steps, the property owner can withdraw their application, right?
Absolutely. It happens. They'll ask for a delay, or eventually they'll decide maybe it wasn't a good idea, so they'll withdraw their application. So they once that happens, it really just closes the file. That case is stopped. It's kind of dead. And if they want to do something different or even restart it in the future, they'd have to go through almost like a brand new process and start all over again.
Yeah. Well, so I'll just ask some questions that I'm seeing pop up here because they're pretty good. Rick says, hey, if construction on a project is moving forward without notification to the property owners nearby, does that mean that the property had already been zoned for that type of construction?
Yes, so absolutely. So if you see something starting construction, they already have the zoning in place, and that is what we call zoning by right. So for example, if you have a property that's designated maybe a commercial 3, which is a fairly large commercial project, you might see something like a superstore, Walmart superstore or something, or HEB store already start construction. There's no requirement or process to notify the neighbors unless they're asking for a change. I will tell you though that what we do at Development Services is a little bit above code, which is that we actually post all of the applications for building permits when we get them, which is usually a month or two before issuance. We also, if they come in for preliminary development meetings, we also post those online. And again, what we have found is that neighbors want to know what's coming in their area. And even if they don't like it and they can't stop it because it meets all the laws and codes, at least maybe they can have a conversation with maybe the property owner, the developer, or at least be aware of what's coming. But we do call that zoning by right, which means they're legally allowed to do that project without having to change the zoning or notify their neighbors.
Right, and that's a good question, Rick. Thanks for asking it. And so, just as a follow-up to my follow-up to that question, however, there is sometimes that situation where some property owner will just say, you know what, I'm building, and they are unaware, right, of the rules, and that's when your department comes in, and sometimes you guys put stop work orders in place, right?
Absolutely. So one of the good decisions I think we as a city made in fiscal year 2012, so 8 or 9 years ago, we merged the code enforcement department with our department because you're right. Sometimes we get calls where somebody started a project without the proper permits or approvals, or they started using their property illegally. We have a dedicated zoning enforcement team, and we take those calls daily and weekly, and we'll go investigate. And if they didn't get the right approvals or they're doing something, we put what's called a stop work order. If they don't stop right away, that day, the next day, we can issue them citations and fines, and eventually I can pull any power to the site. So there are some tools to stop that, but it's a good thing that I have zoning code officers working along with my zoning reviewers. So as these cases come up, we know what's going on and can make sure people come into compliance.
Now, Dave has a question about criteria, and you know what, Dave, if you're on there, unmute your mic, and we'll let you ask your question because it's really a very interesting approach to zoning that you're asking about.
Sure, that's Dave. Rezoning is usually what we don't know about until we see it in the news or a sign in the neighborhood. And you described looking at the tech review would say, is it within the zoning allowed, or among other things, is it within plans that already exist? Other than that, though, what's the criteria for granting a rezoning, and what's the source of that criteria? Out.
Thanks,
Sure.
Dave. Mike?
Thanks, Dave. That's a really good question, and that's one we do get a lot. So zoning is both a kind of a technically objective process, but it's also a little subjective as well, because some projects on a particular piece of land with properties that are already developed and already zoned a certain way wouldn't necessarily fit that well where they would in another area. So for example, my staff, when they do a technical review, you're right, the Unified Development Code and the city's master plan documents that are laws approved by councils well before Councilman Pelaez. But those documents are referred to ensure that they're consistent with those plans. So those plans have some larger groups of how the city was to be developed and continues to be developed as we move forward. You know, it's not all built out yet, although it's a lot more built out than it was almost 2 decades ago when I got here in San Antonio. So we refer to the master plan for consistency. We look at if there are any adverse effects to public health and safety. Now that's a very broad term. There are some rules in our codes and in the land development and planning technical literature out there, but I'll give you just a good example. Is it a good idea? I think everybody can see this. Is it a good idea to put a large, noisy industrial facility right next to a subdivision where a lot of people, of course, live, kids play, those type of things? Well, as you can tell, there's a lot of potential negative impacts to health and safety there. So that would be something that we would not normally recommend, and we would actually usually tell someone not to go down that road because it will be a hard fight. So those are some of the things, those are some of the more obvious things, but we also look at some things like traffic patterns, those type of situations in that area. Now, traffic and drainage, we have a set of rules and criteria no matter what project has to deal with whether you're zoned correctly now or change the zoning later. So some of that we can look at during the zoning process. Others we can look at later during the building permit to make sure that they mitigate and provide the right traffic safeties. So those are some examples of what we look at. I've given you some obvious examples. Certainly there's a longer list, and I can get you a few examples of which I think would illustrate the point more. Maybe we can add on to this either video or send some information out to the councilman staff that they can feed to this group.
Wonderful. Thanks, Mike. And you know, we're getting a lot of really great questions. And I'm thinking some of these are going to be appropriate to ask Dr. Romero when it's her turn to talk. And so I'll tell you, Skip, Chris Garcia, Susan, we're gonna, and JR, we're gonna save your questions to let Mike and Francine Romero tag team on those. But before we go, I do want to ask a question about IDZ zoning. What is that, and what do you want people to know about that, Mike?
So that's a great question. So IDZ zoning, IDZ stands for infill development zoning. It was something that was added to the code almost 20 years ago when the code, our Unified Development Code, was really rewritten in 2001. And it was to help incentivize and loosen some of the rules for developers to incentivize infill development. Infill development is really anything inside 410. And if any of us that were here 20 years ago, we knew that there was a lot of activity and development happening outside of 410, growing outside of 1604, certainly on the north side, some on the west side. You know, we built this code like a lot of cities do to help incentivize, loosen a few of the rules on those parcels that are kind of just infill. They're these small parcels on old development codes, properties that no one was really developing. And we actually just went through a rewrite of that code a couple of years ago because we knew some of the development patterns inside the core, downtown, inside city 410 limits. We just saw some new development patterns. So the city council looked at that, we modified that a little bit. But again, some of that development you see downtown and some of the older neighborhoods where it's getting popular to redevelop it, some of that has been allowed because of the IDZ zoning. So it's been very successful. Some are arguing that it's been a little bit too successful, depending on what side of the argument you're on. But that's what infill development zoning is.
Wonderful. Thanks, Mike. All right, guys. I'm going to introduce you now to my friend, Dr. Francine Romero. And Dr. Romero is one of 11 zoning commissioners. And some of you may have seen her before. She is a trusted and sort of known celebrity here in San Antonio. She often gets to host like big community conversations. And Francine, I remember you were doing these with the Express News about some really important topics. But she's also a professor and chair of the Department of Public Administration at UTSA in their College for Health, Community, and Policy. And she received her PhD in political science from University of California in Riverside. And she's been with UTSA since 1998. She's been on the Zoning Commission for nearly 7 years. And she's also served as the chair of SA's Conservation Advisory Board, as the vice chair of the Parks and Recreation Board, as well as several other citizen advisory groups. And on top of that, no kidding, she is probably one of the smartest human beings I've ever met. So welcome, Francine.
Thank you, Councilman. Everybody hear me okay?
Now I can hear you just fine. And seriously, folks, Francine's got one of the largest frontal lobes you'll ever meet. That lady has more information in her head than any of us put together. Really, really smart.
Yeah,
So,
well.
Dr. Romero, you've got some things you want to share with us, and then we'll open it up for questions for you.
Okay, well, thank you, everybody. I am excited to be here. I'm glad this is finally happening. So on my first slide, I think we just had a little background on the Zoning Commission. So we do have 11 commissioners, and it can be a little bit confusing. We are not city employees. We get paid $20 per meeting. So be clear about that. I think Commissioner Wee is on this meeting as well, so welcome. Who we are, we have more or less experience in the land use field. So you don't have to be an expert in land use to be on the Zoning Commission. Some people are. A lot of people have a background in HOAs, neighborhood involvement. Some people are engineers and attorneys who work in land use. I'm kind of an oddball because I just study and teach land use. So that's really my interest in it, which has grown over the course of my career. So everybody just gets up to speed on what they need to know, no matter what their background is. But overall, we are just citizens, and we are nominated by our council member, but the whole council has to approve us. And we're there for 2-year terms that are basically coterminous with the council members. So on to slide 2. I just on just the structure of what we do a little bit. So when we get a case, we all get, of course, that recommendation from Mike's staff. And I think Mike underplayed that a little bit because that is really, really important. Now, sometimes when citizens see staff recommendation, they will say, oh, so that's what you're going to do. We don't even have to come to Zoning Commission. Well, no, that's not true. We do not have to follow staff recommendation. And sometimes we don't follow staff recommendation. But we put a lot of stock in staff recommendation. Mike's team is really good at analyzing cases from a very professional and neutral perspective. I'm real interested in planning, but I don't have a planning degree. And his people do have planning degrees or other really strong experience. And they know the city code inside out. And the city code is really daunting, and they know everything about it. So staff recommendation, really important. And then of course, we listen to the applicant's argument. The applicant is free to contact us ahead of time, but then they of course present their case during the hearing, and that's when the whole commission hears what the applicant has to say. I also, of course, meet with the council member and District 8 staff to get their perspective on District 8 cases. And that is, of course, closely tied to the neighborhood. So as Mike was saying, people who live in the nearby neighborhoods, your preferences, your concerns are really important because you know things that we might not know. There are things that only you can know who've lived in the neighborhood a long time. And you're also free to contact commissioners ahead of time. It's not just the applicant who can do that. Anybody can send a message to commissioners ahead of time with their ideas on this. And it's not just people who are in the notification area. Anybody can go to Zoning Commission and give their opinion on any case. You don't have to be within the area or have gotten a notice. But if you do get a notice, absolutely read that notice because they can be so important. So you need to know before things start happening. When we make a motion on whether to approve or deny an application, the zoning commissioner from the district makes that motion. And for the other commissioners put a lot of stock in that, but sometimes they overrule us. So I have made motions before that the other commissioners didn't agree with. So you never know what's going to happen at Zoning Commission. And yeah, whatever we vote on, whether we vote to approve or deny the request, that's just a recommendation to City Council. And again, City Council, more often than not, I think approves our recommendations, but they certainly don't have to. They can do whatever they want. So then going to slide 3, I was going to talk a little bit about how do I decide how to vote on a particular case, which I thought was really simple until I started thinking about it. And I loved what Mike said about, well, it's really pretty simple. However, and you get into the weeds so fast with zoning. This is weird because I really like zoning. I really like the topic, and it can be very subjective. Like Mike says, you just cannot get away from that. But we do try and follow principles. And so I wanted to just talk about a couple of those. But you know, I really feel like the entire history of America can be understood by zoning. So there's a lot there to know. So, you know, of course, the first thing we look at, what everybody looks at is compatible land use. So how compatible is the requested new use with the surrounding area? So that's where we start. But then you always hit that first barrier, which is, how does that compatibility with surrounding area compare with the current allowed use? And this can lead to a lot of angst because it's what's there right now or what can be built there right now. But often what citizens are comparing to the change to is what's there right now, which is just open space. Nothing is there. So the change always seems bad in comparison to nothing. But what we really have to do on Zoning Commission is compare the change to what could be built right now. So one example, I think it might have been the councilman's first zoning case when he was first elected, on Hoyerman Road by Friedrich Park, and Jane Neal is here. So if you know me, you know I'm a really fierce defender of anything coming in near Friedrich Park. And there was obviously private property, but it was beautiful. There was nothing there, a bunch of trees, and somebody wanted to change the zoning so they could build, they wanted a PUD, planned unit development, for some small number of fairly small homes. But people were upset, and I was upset because we thought, well, it's nothing, and then they're going to build on it. But if you looked at the zoning that was in place already, it actually allowed for more homes, bigger homes, denser development than what they were asking for. So in that case, you know, it really made sense to support that zoning change, because we had to think about right now, what can they build? And it wasn't as good as the potential change. So that's always our first battle, is to say it's not going to remain vacant forever.
Yeah.
But then just a little bit more on the compatible uses. So, you know, like Mike said, we think about single family residential, multifamily residential, commercial office, and kind of, if you look in any planning textbook, you'll see, well, older planning textbooks, you'll see single family, and then you have multifamily as a buffer, and then you have commercial or office, and that's the standard way of doing it. And industrial, we want to part from everything else. And those play a part in staff recommendations, and they're a really good place to start. So for example, if somebody asked for C3 right next to residential, yeah, you know, I wouldn't support that. But, you know, a lot of professionals are starting to question that really strict separation of uses. You know, after all, those all date from 1926, and I'll only talk about this for a second, but that's when the US Supreme Court decided the Euclid versus Ambler case, which is what said that zoning was constitutional under the US Constitution, and it was never really revisited again. But people are really questioning that. And I'm actually doing a project right now where I'm looking at some of the old state Supreme Court cases before Euclid, where state Supreme Courts were absolutely striking down zoning as a violation of natural rights and the Constitution and everything. And the loudest Supreme Court in that respect was the Texas Supreme Court. And, you know, some of those old arguments are really interesting, with saying like, this just doesn't make any sense. Why can't you have a store next to a neighborhood? It's not necessarily a bad thing. It's not a nuisance. So this more modern thinking, I think, is reflected in the SA Tomorrow plan. And that does call for more mixed use. So I think more and more there's more flexibility, but it makes it a little bit harder to make that call. And so that was a really good question, which was like the question about everything about zoning, about how do you decide? And so now we don't have those real strict lines anymore. It is a little bit harder to decide what makes sense. But I think that, you know, returning to some of the more organic pre-1926 patterns of how neighborhoods develop is important. I always show my students a picture of where my mom grew up in New Jersey. It was all storefronts, and everybody lived in a house behind the store or on top of the store. And so it was absolutely mixed use, all built in the late 19th century, and it worked great. And residents want this as well. So we're starting to see commercial actually mixed in with residential neighborhoods. That's not necessarily a deal killer. So an old case I was thinking about, I think it was when Councilman Nierenberg was still District 8, at Hoyerman and Babcock, that mixed use development, I don't know if it's finished yet or not, but at the time, that was pretty edgy for District 8 to have stores and residences all together in the same place. But it really made sense, because out there, you know, then people don't have to make that long trip to the HEB and have more cars on the road. So, you know, we're seeing that more and more. So again, it gives us more flexibility in determining whether something's appropriate or not. But because you have more options, it makes it a little bit more subjective. And then also just talking about safety, which can also be subjective. We had a case a few months ago with the CrossFit on Desavala Road. And because CrossFit is so popular, people travel across the country to different CrossFit facilities. And some of them want to actually stay overnight there. And so we had a request to change the zoning so they could have little apartments inside the CrossFit facility. But that's on Desavala, across from the post office, or around Cogburn. And it didn't feel right to me. It felt like we were mixing residential with industrial. And I know some of the commissioners thought it was really good. It was really innovative. And why can't we do this? Why can't we have people living there? I ended up making a motion for denial because I just kept thinking about the fire department having to show up, God forbid, for a fire or an industrial accident or something. And all of a sudden saying, what, there's people living here? It didn't seem like a good mix to me. But again, I think staff might have actually recommended approval for that one. So, you know, sometimes it's just really hard to say, but that everybody has a different standard for public safety and the public good. But for me, that one crossed that line. I think, you know, what we see sometimes, I was thinking about with the medical center, that when you have the offices and the commercial in place and then you bring in residential, that goes a lot more smoothly, because people say, oh, sure, there's places to work and there's stores, so why not have some residential? Whereas if you start with residential and then bring in the commercial in the office, that's never quite as smooth a trip when you go in that direction. And then I think the bigger one we're seeing now is that within residential, and this really surprises me, the questions from the community about the density. So if we have a single family and a dense multifamily is coming in next to it, that's probably not a good mix. But sometimes we see neighbors objecting to, from a single family neighborhood, and then the request is in to make the adjacent area another single family residential that's just a little bit more dense. Those are some of the toughest zoning cases we have, just within that residential area. And again, it's really hard to determine what makes sense there. And it is important to hear from the neighbors, because we want to know, you know, what the problem is with having more single family residential there. But, you know, according to standard planning and zoning, having single family next to single family, or low density multifamily next to single family really does make sense. Also just want to say, you know, we have to balance what a good project is from the neighborhood perspective, district perspective, and city perspective. And that can be hard. Give me wave if I'm going too long here. Okay, so this was a project that, don't get nervous because it's not going to happen, but it was going to be to bring in some multifamily at the Fiesta Trails complex at Vance Jackson and Dezavala. And, you know, I think from a city perspective, that made sense because we need more housing. It wasn't affordable housing, but it wasn't going to be really, really expensive. It was near jobs and schools and things, so it made sense in that way. The nearby neighborhood was really opposed to it because they just didn't want that much density near them. And, you know, we ended up having a discussion to kind of break the tie on that because it was good from a city perspective, bad from the neighborhood perspective. We thought about it from the district perspective. And, you know, we were thinking about how Vance Jackson is a really important street in District 8, right? Everybody takes Vance Jackson when 10 is backed up, or when it used to be backed up. So Vance Jackson was really important, you know, and we thought about the Vance Jackson Dezavala intersection and, you know, how terrible that can be. And so we ended up making that decision that from a district perspective, it just didn't make sense. That's just a real keystone piece of the district, and that much density right there and that many people just didn't make sense. And finally, I just wanted to talk about the project itself. You know, we do pay attention to the developer and the actual project that they're pitching along with the zoning change. So somebody who has a history of that kind of thing in the city, that's important because we can see what they've already done. So there's some proof about what they might be doing here. Having developers or the applicants make concessions with neighborhoods, we always like to see that they're talking to the neighborhood, because we can't put conditions on a zoning approval, but applicant can make concessions to the neighborhood. They might be enforced by a covenant or not, but they can do that. And that's always a really good thing to see, that they want to be part of the community. You know, we talk about speculative zoning where somebody just says, I just want to change the zoning on this property so then I can sell it for more money. And people, I say, oh, speculative zoning, it's illegal. It's not really illegal, but you know, it's not great. We do like to see what the project is going to be that they're coming in for. But the other thing I wanted to mention is that it's not always about, we can't just think about the project, because somebody can come in with the greatest project in the world, but we're approving the zoning change and not the project. And so we have to think about all the other things that could happen. So, you know, somebody could come in with a great C2 use. They want to change from whatever to C1 to C2, and they want to put in an art gallery, you know, and that just sounds great. Even near a neighborhood, an art gallery would be wonderful. But C2 can give you a liquor store as well. And it's not that the developer is lying to us, it's just the projects can fall through, or land ends up getting sold. And so we have to think about everything that could be utilized on that C2. So that's all I wanted. Those are my highlights to go over, but I will just echo what Mike said. It is complicated.
Thank you so much, Colleen. I'm sorry, Francine. That's really, really helpful. So I do want to start. You know, Skip has been holding on to a question here, and his question was about the public good. Skip, if you can unmute yourself and ask away. Skip going once. Skip going twice.
I think it might be one of the gentlemen who doesn't have a microphone.
Oh, okay. Well, his question was, you know, to what extent do you consider the public good, and will the public good always trump the property owner or the developer? And so is that a term you all throw around a lot up there in at zoning? You know, with Mike, do you ask about public good?
Yes, the public good, I think, this might be controversial, but I think this is true. The public good should always trump private property rights. I mean, that's an ancient principle, that private property owners cannot harm the public. That's a principle of nuisance that comes from ancient times. But the rub here is, what is the public good? So, you know, and I might throw it to Mike on that, but yeah, that's where we all have different opinions about what the public good is. ensuring that nobody has to have a housing development next to them that's more dense than their housing development. That's a little bit of a tough sell for a public good. It's easy when you say possible harm to the public. That always trumps everything. But when you get out of that fairly small corral of what is clearly a potential harm, that's public good becomes subjective.
Right. And so, as an example of public harm, for example, and this is just me being hyperbolic and hypothetical, we've got, if I were to come to you and say, I want to open up the next Tesla automotive manufacturing plant right in the middle of District 8, right next to Friedrich Park, I think everybody agrees that a manufacturing plant in San Antonio would be in the public good, right? But chances are it would create some serious public harm if we put it right next to such a natural treasure, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I was just thinking about Tesla when we had a discussion, it was a long time ago, but for a Tesla dealership and about the batteries. So I learned a lot about the batteries and the potential harms of those batteries. And so, yeah, even at that, when you're talking about harms, there's a lot of stuff on the internet about how those batteries can explode and get into the water supply and all that, but it may not actually be true. So it's just really, really hard to sort out all that information.
Yeah, because not every case is about inconvenient traffic, right? Or having to see rooftops you don't want to see that might, ruin your beautiful view. Sometimes these cases require a significant amount of technical research on your part, right?
Yes, absolutely. And sometimes we shouldn't be doing that research either. I mean, we don't want to be getting too far away from the land use. So yeah, I mean, like with that Tesla dealership, people were starting to ask questions that were way beyond the bounds of what anybody could know. That's why the federal government came in and really banned anybody denying cell phone towers through the zoning process, because for many reasons, but I think it was getting in the weeds with so many people being an expert about the dangers or not the dangers of cell phone towers, and that was simply taken out of that process.
So Dave S. has a question, and Dave, pick one: environmental risks or gentrification? Dave, you there? I'll ask it for Dave. Dave wants to know how are environmental risks considered by a zoning commissioner?
Well, again, I think there we have to be really careful about what we get into. In District 8, we are led by SAWS quite a bit. So anything that's over the recharge zone, we have to get a report from SAWS on whether they approve of the project or not. So if it's something like some of the stuff that was coming in around 1604-10 that was more industrial uses, or even some of those distilleries and those kinds of places out there, they involve chemicals. So, we really had to work with SAWS on that. But again, SAWS is the expert on that. But sometimes I think commissioners question them. Car washes is a big one. Car washes over the recharge zone. So we consider that. Land use is our basic charge. And I think that when the city needs to bring an environmental concern to us, they do. And that sounds like a little bit of a cop-out, but sometimes we have to say those potential environmental dangers will be handled at another stage of the process, that these are not necessarily for us to be considering.
Francine, we promised Susan an opportunity to ask her question, and we're having problems with this whole mute and unmute thing. So Susan's question is, how does the UTSA Regional Center change zoning? And, to what extent does that go into your algebra when you do it up on the zoning dais?
Well, the regional centers are really helpful. They make zoning easier because I think they recognize the fact that there are not little, but sort of individualized downtowns in San Antonio that are not necessarily the downtown of San Antonio. And so UTSA Center is a downtown for us. So it does make it easier. course, this area, I live in the UTSA area, and it's changed a lot. It's, you know, it used to be, there was UTSA and then everything residential. And now, because of the UTSA plan, a lot of things are coming in and getting approved that maybe wouldn't have had the justification without the plan. So for example, that huge mixed use piece on UTSA Boulevard, that made sense because it fit with the UTSA regional plan, regional center. Because you know, you have to start thinking about this. University is growing. I work at UTSA, so full disclosure. The university is growing. We need the infrastructure for that. We need commercial. We need some student housing, but then just apartments where anybody could live. So I think it takes the heat off of people saying, oh, everything's just chaotic at UTSA. You know, somebody wants to put in a bar. Okay, fine. Somebody wants student housing. Okay, fine. Is anybody controlling all this? Is anybody planning it? And the answer is, yeah, it is controlled and it's governed by that UTSA planning process.
So, Francine, is it fair to say that when people come and talk to y'all at the dais, like, you know, neighborhoods who say, I need my zoning commissioners to, you know what I feel about this, is it safe to say that you are ignoring all of them and you're just doing whatever Mike Shannon and the developer tell you to do, or is the opposite true?
Yeah, you might ask some of Mike's employees about that. No, you know, and
I
like
wish
Mike
it were
said,
that easy.
you know, his staff don't know everything from the neighborhood, and they admit that. So yeah, we absolutely need to know what is going on in the neighborhood. But you know, and I know the neighbors sometimes get frustrated with us because, you know, because people want to say traffic, 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 and we kind of have to say, yes, we know, but that's everywhere. And so there are some other principles we have to listen to, but absolutely, we want to hear from the neighbors.
And, you know, just as because I'll forget to not if I don't ask you later, Dr. Romero, you live in District 8, right?
I do live in District 8.
And you have to put up with this terrible traffic too, right?
I do, yes. I haven't been driving anytime lately. Yeah, I mean, I'm lucky because I work at the university, so I don't have to go in and out at rush hour, but sometimes I do. So yeah, I mean, I could come up with my list of top 10. And yeah, it's funny. Sometimes when neighbors come up and say, we have the worst traffic in the city. And sometimes I'll say, you know what? You are on my top 10 list of the worst traffic in District 8.
That's right.
But
That's right.
yes, it is horrible everywhere.
So y'all, that was the Francine Romero portion of this presentation. And I've got I'm going to just talk a little bit about what we do in my office. And then what we'll do is we'll just open it up for questions for Mike and Dr. Romero. And it'll be an Ask Me Anything sort of session. So let's start here real quick. You know, I've been serving in office. Next slide. I've been serving in office now for about 3 years, roughly 3 years. And, you know, the one thing that is the most difficult part of our job, and that's myself and then my entire team, who I'll talk about in a second, is this zoning, because it's so personal to folks. And everybody has such strong feelings about what the zoning should be, could be, or should not be. And, you know, our job is, as you see on the slide, is really to serve as the liaison or the facilitator between neighborhood associations, neighbors, businesses, and then Mike's staff and Francine Romero and the developers, and bring everybody's information together so that we can then synthesize it and then redistribute it out to everybody else, right? So that the neighbors know what the property owner is thinking, and that Mike knows what Francine is thinking, and that Francine knows what the developer's thinking. And the more information all of us have, the better. And so there's a process. And next slide. There's a process here. And I want to walk you through when and how we get involved and when we don't get involved, because that's just as important. And so I'll start by telling you that when we get involved is when an applicant submits an application to Mike Shannon's group. Mike earlier told you that you can send one in by mail or online, or drive on over to Mike's office and drop off your application, and that process then begins. But we get a notification at my office too, and Mike's team says, hey, somebody has applied for a rezoning. And then my zoning director, a very smart woman named Laura Garza, she calls the applicant and says, hey, what are you thinking? Right? What is it that you've got in mind for this property going forward? Because as soon as that yellow sign gets posted on your property, we're going to start getting calls. So I want to know more or less what's on your on the horizon, right? And then Laura will give that applicant, who's oftentimes represented by a lawyer or an engineering firm, the contact information for you, everybody watching this video right now, your HOA. And and Laura will say, well, listen, one of the requirements that Councilman Pelaez has is that you go work with these neighbors, and you set up some meetings, and you go pitch your project, and you let them know exactly what you have planned for, the area surrounding their neighborhood. And that's because we don't want any of y'all caught by surprise. And so we give them the information. Now, the frustrating part for us is that most of the time these builders will go out and call the HOA and never get their calls returned, right? Or they'll reach out and send an email and get crickets, in return. And that's really frustrating because that first step of meeting and engaging, that's really, really important, right? And so I think this is where I need to tell you all, lean on your HOA board a little bit if you ever wonder whether or not they're doing everything they could do to represent you well, and insist on them making sure to return all the emails and return the calls. And that's because if they don't return the builder's call, and if those meetings aren't set up, I'm out here and my team's out here assuming that those things are getting done, right? And Francine and Mike are assuming those things are getting done too. And that's probably the most important step in this whole process. Anyway, at some point, we'll follow up with the, and by we, I mean Laura and her team. Laura and her team will follow up with the HOA board. And then sometimes we'll even, go to those meetings if a larger meeting at an HOA is required. And so Laura will take time off from raising her children and spending time with her husband, and she'll go in the evenings and she'll go to HOA board meetings and sit down and listen to the presentations, and she'll very quietly just sit in the back room taking notes, and she's writing down everything that the neighbors are saying. And so these meetings are important. And then after those meetings are convened, she also goes and checks out our Facebook page, our email, people send us letters and voicemails, and she compiles all of that good stuff. And what's really important at this stage is to make sure that me, your councilman, and his staff have all of the information available. And that's not just how you feel. I don't want to see, a project like this, but tell us why. And maybe even give us suggestions as to what you think would be better. Because I get it, you don't want it, and that's important, right? But options is what we're looking for at this stage. So then after that, there may be a point where we sit down, where I keep saying we, but Laura sits down with the developer and says, hey, look, we're hearing, just a cacophony of negative reactions to what you've put out there. And, I'm not your lawyer and I'm not your advisor, but you may want to revisit your project. You may want to go back and revisit with these homeowners associations to see if you guys can iron out some, whatever differences you've got before you head up to, your zoning commission meeting, because Dr. Romero, she's a very, very, fine filter of these kinds of cases. And she's going to ask you, how much work have you done with the neighbors, and, and what do they feel about it? And we want to make sure that, if you are going to move forward with this, you pull from every single engagement lever you've got to communicate with the neighborhoods. And at that point, if it does make it in front of Dr. Romero and the other 10 zoning commissioners, Laura will be in the back of the room also. She goes to our zoning commission meetings, and she'll monitor the case, and she'll just be sitting there watching the debate happen. And then, there comes a point soon after that when I get briefed. I haven't been involved in this process until that one point, and that is at or around the time when it's presented to the zoning commission. And the reason I don't get involved in all of the projects is because so many of them just never even make it to that one point. A lot of them get pulled, or they fizzle out, or they get tabled before they even make it to Dr. Romero and her colleagues up there at the zoning commission. But if it manages to make it all the way up there, and it gets a thumbs up or a thumbs down from the zoning commission, then Lauda and her team will come and they give me a pretty thorough presentation. And the questions I ask are, show me the project, show me the rationale that Francine and her colleagues, applied in this one case. Tell me why Mike Shannon and his team are recommending or not recommending. And then tell me what your dealings have been with the developer, and tell me what the neighbors have said. And it's a really good opportunity for me to ask a lot of questions. And sometimes I'll bring in the neighborhoods, or I'll go to the neighborhoods, and we'll have a conversation about what's wrong and what's right with the project. And sometimes I'll meet with the builder or the property owner and say, look, here are my concerns. There's still time to rescue this thing if y'all can figure it out. And we sometimes fix it there, and then it'll get resubmitted. But most of the time, I'm not involved until the end of this process. And once I've gathered enough information, then I have to go pitch it to my council colleagues too. And we have to go talk to my council colleagues, and I'll say, look, I've got this project. This is all the work that we did. And then we vote. And there comes a time to vote. Now, remember, what we're voting on is to approve of, or to ratify the recommendation of the zoning commission. So Dr. Romero does not zone properties. She recommends zoning, right? And those recommendations then come to city council, and it's ultimately city council that rezones or doesn't rezone something. And throughout this entire process, folks, I think the most important thing to remember is that there's engagement opportunities for you from beginning to end, right? From the moment that sign goes up on the property, and you've seen it, the yellow sign, that's your invitation to start calling Mike, Dr. Romero, myself, Laura, and really start expressing yourself. And then once you end up at the zoning, once it's in Mike's hands, there's then opportunities for you to contact him. And we'll ask Mike in a second, Mike, how do people talk to you, right? And then Francine, how is it that people know when to show up to zoning commission, and what should they say and what should they expect? And then, as the process is moving forward and it finally ends up in my court, how do, and when do you come and talk to us? And we'll cover that right now. But, there's no shortage of really boring projects that are just so simple and right, that get no objections from anybody. They're a perfect fit for the neighborhoods, and nobody responds, nobody shows up to the meeting, and we end up, those projects are the ones that I dream of. Those are the easy ones, and and if what I would give for all projects to be that way. But there's some hard ones. Some really difficult ones, and those are the ones that have given me the little bit of white hair I've got right here. Mike dyes his hair, but I don't. I keep mine all natural. So, folks, you can go, you can talk to your zoning commission, and you can talk to Mike's staff by email, obviously, voice message or phone calls, and there's a way to sign up to speak at zoning. So if we don't have, do we have another slide? Nope, no other slide. All right. So let's do some questions, and let's see what we can come up with together as far as attempts to stump Dr. Romero. You will not be successful. She is unstumpable. So the first thing is, Mike, how do people talk to your team? How do the folks on this phone call who are watching today engage with you guys? And give me phone numbers or email addresses or the website.
Sure. Thank you, Councilman. Yeah, so it's real simple. The best way to get in touch with us is one, to get on our website, sanantonio.gov /DSD as in Development Services Department. If you can't, if that doesn't, you want to just call in, you can call in because we have all those numbers online, but 210-207-1111 is my department call center. You can, anything development related, you can call that number 207-1111 and say, I want to talk to someone about zoning. I saw a yellow sign, or I just have generic questions. You'll be forwarded on to one of our zoning team members. And if you can't remember, you're just not sure, totally forgot, just call 311. 311 folks will just say, what are your questions? What do you need? Say, I need to speak with Development Services Zoning, and they'll get you to us. It's that simple. But we would love to talk to you. The more you know about zoning, the easier it is for you and your neighbors to understand and help us decide what may or may not be right as these cases go forward. So.
Thanks, Mike. Now, Mike, when things finally do get to the zoning commission level, people used to just show up, right? Wait their turn in that room in those uncomfortable chairs you guys have, and then wait for hours until they got an opportunity to let Francine and her colleagues know. But we are now facing a pandemic, right? And so you guys have made some changes to the procedure. So can you talk to us a little bit about that?
Absolutely, and that was critical. We actually stopped our zoning commission for about a month, all of our boards and commissions, because they do not work without public engagement, and not just, a small amount. It has to be really easy to use, and we need to ensure that if one person wants to speak or 25 want to speak, we do that. So you can do almost anything. One, you can mail in a response. You can email in responses that we will actually read to the commissioners verbatim when that is, if you don't want to be there, you just want it heard. If you want to leave us a voicemail, there's a voicemail number that you can leave a voicemail, and you can say, I want to, for 2 minutes talk about this particular case, why I love it, why I hate it. We will read that. We are we're playing those videos, those voicemails to the commissioners. And then lastly, if you want a callback and you want to be part of that meeting that is live streamed on the city's website, while you're watching, when it comes to your case and your turn, my team members will have your phone number. They will call you. You will pick up the phone, and you will have 2 minutes, and you will be actually talking to the zoning commissioners. And again, you can tell them, I love this project. I fully support it. I hate this project. Please deny it, or anything in between. So we're trying to make it such that you can, however you want to be part of the process, however easy it is for you, we want you there. So we have all those methods, and it's on our website. We certainly, if we don't have, if we haven't sent it out already, we can send it out to everybody after this meeting.
All right. Well, listen, I'll forget to mention it later, so I'm mentioning it right now. Folks, for all of you that signed up, and if we have your email address, we'll send you the links that Mike's talking about. We'll send you all the contact information that you need. We'll even send you the presentations that you saw today to kind of help you. If you have trouble going to sleep tonight, you can go through them all over again and and read those. Francine, how do people talk to you? How do they reach you? And or do you get your first contact with with constituents and voters at the zoning meeting?
No, people can contact us either through the District 8 office, and they have all my contact information. And then I believe also Mike's people, the zoning case manager, if somebody says, I want to contact my zoning commissioner or every zoning commissioner, they will give them that. So my email, you can use my UTSA email, francine.romero@utsa.edu, or my personal is francineromero9@gmail. And so yeah, that's fine. The only thing, if you email all the commissioners, that's fine, but we can't respond. because then we could potentially be violating the Open Meetings Act. We basically might say, you know, thank you for your input. I will read your message, and we're not trying to brush you off, but we can't, you know, really get into email conversations. I could just as a single zoning commissioner. So just realize if you contact the entire zoning commission, you are reaching more people, but you're restricting their ability to respond to you because of Open Meetings Act.
That makes
And I
sense.
will say that the way the staff is handling these meetings, it sounds like it wouldn't work, but it does. It's amazing. They have different people. They got the calls queued up. And, you know, I would say when you do the live call-in, it's probably the most effective way, because then if they'll keep you on the line and ask if any commissioners want to ask you a question. And so that can be helpful. And I would just advise people, if they are calling in or writing a letter, just get right to the point. And, you know, really the shorter, the better, so we can really know whether you're for or against and why. That's the most helpful way.
So, you know, Mike and Francine, both of you, do you only review the paperwork that the applicant sends you, or will you go out to the property and put boots on the ground and lay your eyes on it?
Well, just from our standpoint, every single one we have to go out and take a look at it. So part of our due diligence is, again, we look at the paperwork, what the code says, what they're asking. We have a conversation with the applicant to make sure we're not missing anything, but we actually go out to the property and look at that surrounding area to help us make that determination. As I mentioned earlier, this project might be perfect based on the surrounding area here, but maybe not somewhere else. I think Dr. Romero had a great example of that Fiesta Trails, is that project, that housing, which is so needed in San Antonio as a whole, but is that the right intersection for that? You know, and those are the tough questions that we have to, and you really have to see it. You can't use Google Earth. You can't use satellite images. You can do that to get an idea, but you physically have to be out there, and that's what my staff does, because we want to give a good recommendation to Dr. Romero and the other commissioners as well.
Doc, what do you go out there and you walk the properties?
I go to the District 8, all the District 8 cases, I go out to them. Sometimes you can walk or not walk. When I was on Planning Commission, I used to go to all of them. I got chased by so many angry dogs in different places, but yeah, and Mike's right. I mean, yeah, Google Earth is just not the same. When you go out there, you can just feel, you can see things that you can't see otherwise. You need to go different times of the day, see the different traffic patterns out there. So yeah, I definitely go out and look at them. I don't go to every single location for all the not District 8 cases. I can't go to all those, and you never know which one's going to pop up as controversial in a meeting. But so for District 8, I go to all of them. Yeah.
Good. Well, and thank you for doing that. You know, speaking of traffic, JR had a great question. And his question is about TIAs, our traffic impact analyses. And my understanding is that TIAs have to be part of, you know, these, a lot of these projects that are proposed. But, you know, are you be doing traffic studies during this COVID no traffic time? And will that, you know, sort of impact the project? Are you taking a snapshot, you know, when you shouldn't be taking that snapshot because of an abnormal time, Mike?
That's a great question. And actually the TIA topic, and whether it's zoning or not, because again, a lot of those projects that already have their proper zoning, they still have to meet all the traffic mitigation rules that the state has and that we have. But the short answer is no, this is not the normal. We don't have schools in session. I know it's summertime, but this was happening in the April and May time frame. We had a lot of conversation with engineers on, hey, we can't take a look at your specific scenario right now. So we can either use some historical data. There's a lot of historical data on a lot of these areas that we have, or we have to postpone them until it gets to be a little bit more normal. We can make some assumptions and factor in that, you know, things will get back to traffic. But then there's also some discussion about maybe there won't be as much traffic with a lot more working from home. But to take a snapshot right now would be inappropriate. To go do a traffic count analysis, you know, on the UTSA campus or any of our roads. I think Dr. Romero jokes about I-10. You're right, that would be inappropriate. So we certainly don't do that. I don't know exactly how it's going to unfold, you know, 6 months, a year from I'm not sure any of us do, but we'll be monitoring that pretty quickly.
Francine, Kristen Moxigemba asks a question. How do we slow the growth and partner with urban planners to create a more green and aesthetically pleasing space? And, parks aside, she says that, we look like one big strip mall around here. I know that you're a student of this, what we're doing here, land planning and zoning and government. And are you seeing a movement, or any trends around the United States or in San Antonio where this is happening?
I hope so. I think there was a time in District 8 where it was just, the growth was just so fast. I think before you came in, it was just, everything happened so fast. There was really no time for planning. And that's one of the reasons why, the SA Tomorrow plan, it sounds boring, and the UTSA Regional Center, but it really does control that kind of thing. And I think what we're starting to see now, well, we don't have a whole lot of zoning cases in District 8. I mean, for a while, when I first went on zoning commission, like every single case was 8 or 9. And now, the big growth is downtown. So in a way that's good, I think, because we're doing the infill again. And that's important, because for a while it was just like, the heck with downtown, we're just going to grow as fast as we can outside of city limits. And that's where I think, some stuff came in that's doesn't look good. And yeah, it definitely gives that view to people. I think now that opportunities have opened up a little bit more for downtown with the IDZ, that it's easier to develop downtown. I think we're seeing some more careful kinds of development in District 8, some more of the mixed use kinds of things. So again, that UTSA Village on UTSA Boulevard, that is huge. And that took out a huge swath of old ranch land. But I think they're doing it the right way. I think they went slow with it. They planned it. It fits with the regional center. And then even on the smaller scale, some of the new stuff that's coming in around 10 in Camp Bullis area where I live, I don't know what that's all going to be, all that new commercial that's coming in, but it's just planned differently. So I think the market is there for better planning out here. I don't know when it changed or exactly why, but I think it's going more in the right direction now.
Thank you for that answer, Mike. A quick, sort of a quick one, and then sort of an in-depth question here. The quick one is, hey, we're currently going through a rezoning near my neighborhood, but I don't see the sign posted anymore. Why is that?
I don't know. I hope it's because either the applicant withdrew and we took it down. But if it did, if someone took it, then we need to know about it. So if we can get that piece of property, or you can call in and let us know, or send it to me. I give you my direct number as well, 210-207-5006. Then we'll find out why it's not there. But it could be that they withdrew the case. It could be that the case was already approved or denied, or we have had some where some signs have been taken, which those aren't good, because then it helps. It doesn't help the public engagement. So we'll go and put a new sign if the case is still active.
Now, I'm being told here by my my crack investigators that it also may be the case that because there haven't been zoning commission agendas, and this case may not be on the agenda, the sign is no longer needed. Is that right?
That could be, but normally though, we like to get that sign out as soon as we get, maybe not the next day, but fairly quickly, we like to get the sign up. We know there's been a lot of pause and some delays on our case deliveries, if you will, or case settings. But if that sign were up an extra month or two, that's okay. There's no time limit for that sign to be there. And actually, if it was there a little bit longer, that would only help people to stay engaged, knowing it's going through the process, to ensure we get the good engagement from the neighbors.
So, Mike, I'm going to put you on the spot now, because Chris Garcia, our planning commissioner, is on the line also, and welcome, Chris. So glad you're here. Chris, unmute your screen, because I know that you've asked a few questions here, and I wanted to give our planning commissioner the opportunity to ask what's on your mind.
There was a couple of things I had on my mind. Mainly just wanted to make sure people understood how they can respond and how they can provide input, and I think that was already covered. I think the other thing I asked was, one of the big concerns are traffic and drainage. Both of our commissions get a lot of comments on traffic and drainage. So can you talk about where that comes into the process and where that gets looked at? Because that's a lot of times we get a lot of those questions.
Great question. And thanks for
Sure.
your service, Chris. Mike, take it away.
Sure. So I'm gonna even add the third big one, which is environmental or tree preservation. I think I saw a call there. So many people ask, where are the studies? Where's the full traffic study? Where's the full drainage study? Where's the full tree preservation study, environmental study? There many times that's not fully done at the zoning commission, and it's not required to do so by state and local code. However, those are important questions. I think Dr. Romero and the commissioners, Chris, when the planning commission is looking at it, they are asking some of those questions. What are the preliminary results or preliminary plans from the developer on how you're going to address some of these overarching concerns for this project in this area? Now, as I mentioned earlier, the actual traffic requirements, the drainage requirements, and the tree preservation requirements are all spelled out in our code. So no matter what project you're working on, whether it has a zoning change associated with it or not, or it's already zoned, or it's even grandfathered, we didn't even talk about that, but grandfathered by the state law. We live in Texas. This is a property rights state. There's a lot of grandfathering laws. Some of you have seen some of those projects. They may have some older rules, but all those are happening at the platting, with their setting up their piece of property and building permits. So it's this, you'll have a little bit of information, sometimes a moderate amount of information at the Planning and Zoning Commission, but the real full detailed analysis and all those rules kick in when you start designing your project, meaning the architects and engineers start laying out where the buildings are going to go, telling us what trees they're going to propose to either remove, relocate, save. Same thing with drainage. How are we going to get the water that's maybe with this new impervious cover, this parking lot or the rooftops? Where's that water going to go, and how is it not going to flood everybody else? But all of those are a little bit after zoning, but I will tell you, they're not ignored at the Zoning and Planning Commission because, as Dr. Romero mentioned, a lot of that is taken into consideration on that parcel in that area. So that's kind of the big, broad answer to those questions. And yes, I did throw tree preservation in there for you, Councilman, because I know you get a lot of questions on that one too.
Yeah, tree preservation is is something that you and I and Francine had to talk a lot about last year. Francine, if you don't remember, well, I'm sure you remember, you and I are wearing the body scars because of it. There was an apartment complex project, and it almost seemed like overnight the builder just shaved off all the trees on a hill, and you and me and Mike Shannon, we got all the calls and people, asking us, how could you permit this? And there are properties out there, right, Francine, that have already been zoned for something that like that. And they've just been zoned that way for, 10, 15, 20 years. And they're just out there sort of sleepers. And at some point, somebody's going to say, hey, I can build an apartment complex here. I will. Is that the, how do you manage those kinds of expectations, and how have you seen that play out, let's say up here on the north side?
Yeah, well, starting with that one, a couple of things. I mean, the zoning, having zoning in place doesn't allow you to ignore or be vested from the city's current tree ordinance. There are people who are vested from the tree ordinance because of their development plans that were filed earlier. So that's one thing, and they can be vested in, but it's really not linked to their zoning. The other thing, and I know people never want to hear this, and it never seems true, but sometimes when you see a property that looks like it's been completely clear cut, they actually are in compliance with the city's tree ordinance. It's tricky in that way because you see all the trees that are cut down, and then there may still be a lot of trees that are standing, they're not the part we see. And I've said the same thing many times. I just called and said, this cannot be in compliance with the tree ordinance. And it actually is. And we actually have one of the toughest tree ordinances in the nation. And I know people laugh at that, but it is actually true that we have a really tough tree ordinance. You know, the other thing is just to keep in mind that, yeah, well, you know, Texas is a property rights state, and you just have to think about every property that there is has, and green sticks and red sticks, right? So green sticks are all the things they're allowed to do, and red sticks are all the things they're not allowed to do. And green sticks are things like the zoning that they have in place. If they are vested against the tree ordinance, there aren't that many left that are vested against the tree ordinance. So, you know, like it or not, on different properties, we have to just realize that there are rights that are attached to that property. And, you know, I think the zoning managers can help people to understand what those rights are, or non-conforming rights that people have. That, you know, if you have a use that's in place when you're annexed by the city, but you get a different kind of zoning, you're allowed to keep that use going. So, yeah, I don't know, I'm crazy. I like to look at the UDC and read it. But you learn a lot in there about the kinds of rights that people hold. And it's important to know, because everybody has those rights. So you should know what they are for your own property as well.
Yeah, and that's the trick, right? Is that a lot of people think that, zoning is something that just happens and is a creature of somebody in San Antonio invented it, right? But the reality is every major city, in fact, even small cities throughout the United States and even the world, have some sort of zoning. I know that in Mexico they have got zoning, in Europe they've got zoning, and this is something that's been around for a long, long time, because people decided that in cities there has to be an order to things, right? And the last thing you want is to have, a manufacturing plant right next to, a school or a church or a neighborhood. Hey, Mike, I got a question for you. Francine and I have, like I said, battle scars, right, from some of these projects. And one of them was out, up here on the north side, over in the hills of Crown Ridge. And we got a lot of calls from neighbors saying, hey, I can't believe you're going to be allowing someone to build something here next to my neighborhood. When I bought my property, the realtor told me that everything from here all the way to Fredericksburg, from here to the horizon, was going to be trees, because it was all zoned R, which means rural, and we tell them, we think that maybe your realtor may not have known what they were talking about, or they didn't tell you the whole story. Does that happen? And, where somebody tells, another person, oh, this is going to be greenbelt forever. And how often do you guys come up against that?
Well, it absolutely happens, and I don't want to paint the picture. I do go out and talk with a lot of the realtors, the San Antonio border realtors, and I mean they're great to work with, and they have rules and laws about telling the truth to not only buyers but sellers, and disclosure and all that. But I will tell you, we do get that enough that we've had classes, the zoning 101 class, we do DSD academies. We want to get out there and let people know that, one, we want you to know what you can do on your property. We want you to know what your neighbors or potential neighbors can do, but especially those green spaces. Those green spaces that are next to you or next to your future home, there's a good chance that won't be green space forever. And there's a fairly easy way to check on that. Our website that I mentioned earlier, we have a zoning map that's very simple to use, even if you're just a novice on the internet, GIS. You can go on the map. It's kind of like going on an app on your phone, the map. So you can type in the property that you're looking at and see what's next to you. And you can see if it's dedicated as park, and probably going to be a park for a long time. But if it's not, and it has something like a commercial zone or residential zone or something multifamily zone, somebody's going to build something there. Maybe not today, maybe not next year, but eventually. And District 8 is a very popular market, and I think it's exciting that it's popular, but it has some challenges. So again, any questions on that? We've talked to the realtors how to get that information. We've talked to, we go to HOAs, or we used to go to HOAs. Now we do these Zoom calls. But that's one we want people to have that information at their fingertips so they can trust their realtor, but always verify. It's just smart.
Yeah. So the takeaway on that one is, if somebody tells you this is going to be a green belt forever and ever and ever, you may want to double check that, right?
Yep. Very much so.
All right. So guys, closing arguments time. All right. What is the one takeaway, Dr. Romero? What is the one thing you want folks to remember from this conversation today?
I guess I want people to remember that we really do want to know what you know about your neighborhood. If you are giving us information on a zoning case, we want to know, give us the details on what the harms would be, or if you're in favor of it, what the specific benefits would be. And I think echoing what Mike just said, I mean, even if you're not in the market to buy, knowing what's going on around you, what is protected, what is not protected, is really important to know, and what your rights are as a property owner as well.
Thank you. Mike, a closing argument, please, and then there's a gotcha question coming right after you finish.
All right. Well, I would just say, again, thanks, everybody. The one thing about zoning that I try to tell everybody is be involved. It's a difficult, zoning laws are difficult. The process can sound a little intimidating, but make sure you get involved. I will even tell you, in working with both sides, homeowners, neighborhood groups, adjacent property owners, and the developers that want to redevelop or change the zoning. Most of our developers, they want you to be engaged so they know what your concerns are so they can help mitigate them. So therefore, having everybody engaged is the best effort, is the best chance for a good outcome. Maybe it's not the one everybody wants 100%, but we do get some really good projects when people come to the table.
Mike, Francine, go do interesting things and solve the world's problems. Thanks so much for joining us. And folks, thank you so much for joining us. Be safe.